Hi,
Hi,
Shay.
Anna. Are you excited?
I am. Are you excited?
I'm so excited. Listeners, today we're doing something we haven't done before.
Exciting.
We're talking to author Miriam Plotinsky about her new book, Teach More, Hover Less: How to Stop Micromanaging Your Secondary Classroom.
And listeners, we encourage you not to jump to any conclusions. Shay and I believe there's something for teachers of all kinds in this book.
You can trust us.
It's a good one. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shay. And this is Miriam.
I am Miriam Plotinsky. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have two professions. I call one my day job, and one, when I'm being a little bit flip, I call it my side hustle. But it's just as important to me as my day job. So I work for a very large school district, the 14th largest in the nation, as a secondary English language arts and literacy specialist. I work with schools, all grades 6 to 12, English departments and English leaders to help with whatever it is they need. Sometimes it's professional development, sometimes it's very focused on one teacher, sometimes it changes all the time, which is one of the things I like because it's very unpredictable and interactive, and each day is different. So then in the evenings, I do teach teachers at night as well. It's a class called Studying the Skillful Teacher, so it's about teaching methodology, and that's a great way to spend time. And then early in the morning before work starts, so like 4 o'clock in the morning,
Oh my gosh.
I write things. I know. That's what it has to happen because I also have 3 kids and a dog. So, right. So in the very early hours, I write. It started off as short pieces, and then it became books. And I just finished the first draft of my 3rd book.
Wow.
Awesome.
So
You're a busy woman. Yeah.
Little bit.
Very busy.
So that's a nutshell.
Yeah. That's a really packed nutshell right there.
And since Miriam is a writer, we set her up with a fun little writer-specific icebreaker.
I love icebreakers. Shay hates them.
I do. I hate participating in them. I understand their value.
They're very polarizing. It's okay. They polarize
Exactly. But so this question kind of came out of our work as podcasters, and that we noticed that we use the same words or turns of phrase over and over and over again. So as someone who writes, what word do you find yourself using over and over again when writing?
It's kind of a boring one, but I use the word often way too often. So I'm sitting in front of my computer. I was doing this an hour ago. I was like, tends to, I'm trying to find ways to say it because I'm trying to qualify. Like when you're writing about schools and education, if you don't qualify what you say, people are going to come at you and be like, well, that's not how it works. So you're trying to do that. So I say that too much.
Yeah, all that hedging.
rough.
Yeah, the hedging is a heavy lift work.
Yeah.
Anna, I'm glad she said it. Icebreakers can be polarizing.
Oh, Shay, you're so dramatic. Deep down, you know they're fun.
Polarizing! I don't know about that. But I do know it was fun for us to act like publishing execs for an hour. We asked Miriam to pitch us her book. Let's start with sort of big picture. What's new? What's different about it? How did you get here?
So what is not different about it is the whole idea of student-centered learning. And I wanted to say that right off the bat because that is not a wheel that anyone's reinventing, but I do strongly believe that it's one that we have forgotten about, especially during and post-pandemic, because there have been other areas of urgency. So one thing I felt was the urgent need to remind people of various things they could do to try to create that kind of environment. What I'm hoping my book offers that others don't is a much stronger emphasis on practical application as opposed to research or theory. Sometimes, this is not always the case, once again, here I go qualifying. We read books about education and they have a lot of ideas in them and they sound great, but we are overwhelmed. We are in the middle of trying to teach and plan and assess and reflect. And there just isn't time to think about how does this fit into what I do. So my idea was, let me give people a bunch of stuff. They can flip around, find something, go, that looks doable for me, and try it right away. So that's what I'm always trying to do. I used to do in-house professional development, and now I do it sort of on a district scale. But with my writing, it's what I want to do too, which is use this right away. Because if you can't see that, I feel like you've lost everyone. You know, when teachers don't see it, they're understandably gone. That's when they're sitting there grading papers in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's important, of course, for us to have, you know, the research, the theory to support what it is we're peddling, right? But if you don't have those sort of bite-sized pieces for teachers to latch on to, I agree, you lose them quickly.
Something that we really appreciated as we were reading was how digestible of a read it was. Miriam included a lot of figures and tables with practical activities to try out.
Yeah. She also included reflection questions throughout.
And you know how we feel about reflection questions.
And there are a lot of case studies that help illustrate her points. I found it really easy to connect with the teachers and the students she talks about.
Yeah, we were curious about what led her to want to write this
your turning point. What led you to reinvent your teaching?
There were a couple different factors. First of all, the self-serving one was exhaustion. I was just so tired all the time. And I think especially the shift in practice came around the time, to be honest, in my personal life that I was starting to have kids. So this was like 15 years ago. And I couldn't put all that into my teaching anymore and come home and then be with, I was with children all day who were awesome and gave them everything I had. Then I came home. I was with my children, gave them nothing because there was nothing left in the tank. So that was the first thing. I was thinking there must be a better way to do this. The second factor was a class that I accidentally was teaching that showed me how to do it. It was an elective course, and it allowed me to be more experimental and try some things out without some of the constraints that I had in my core-oriented courses, and then I could apply them once I figured out what worked and didn't. And finally, the other big piece was things that people would say to me. I remember a kid coming to me at the beginning of class, the whole, what are we doing today? Oh, we're talking about the book again. It's always the same. Or a teacher in the back of my room, we're talking about something in a discussion and kids are trying to steer a different way. And I'm being very rigid, like, oh no, we have to talk about this. And the conversation goes flat and he looked at me and we shared a classroom. He was like, that conversation died. And he was just being kind of funny, but it made me think, what am I doing? Why do I keep shutting people down? Not meaning to, but what's happening? So all those things really came together. And then after the method started being successful, I would try to describe them to people. When I became a school-based leader, I would try to share this with teachers, and it wasn't working out too well. So eventually I found a way to write it down. And that's what this book is.
Miriam is on the right podcast. I appreciate how she took her process of reflecting on her practice and turned it into something so many teachers could benefit from.
Yeah. Actually, let's hear a bit more about who Miriam had in mind when she wrote her book and what readers can expect to take away.
Hover less for what can educators learn from it? Who can learn from it?
So it's really easy to say that it's for everyone, but I also want to recognize my own expertise and where it falls. So I have been in secondary education for almost my entire professional career. There were a few years in there where I worked with pre-K to 12. And I learned a lot, but I still wouldn't say that's where, I feel the most comfortable telling people what I think works. So for that reason, the book is honed in on secondary classrooms. And there's also that element of autonomy that exists with a hover-free approach that's, I actually think that the best hover-free teaching I probably saw in my entire career was in elementary classrooms. Because with centers and stations and philosophies around how to do that, it's amazingly skillful when you go in there. But just in terms of explaining it to people who had not yet thought about teaching that way, that was why the focus went into secondary. In terms of looking at a population, for example, an ESL population, what I try to think about is what can everyone do that they're not doing already? Or what can you stop doing that someone else could do? there are these charts that we make. I think there's one in the book, I do, you do, we do setup, where it's like, what am I doing? What are you doing? What are we all doing together? And I think about the students that we work with who come from a variety of backgrounds and language focus and whatever it might be. And maybe the goal is just, I'm going to try to increase language production in the 4 domains as much as I can. So when we're looking at reading, writing, speaking, listening, what can my students do that I'm doing for them right now? And just asking that question. Maybe that's a place to start. Maybe it's, I want to have my students ask more questions. Let's see what kinds of questions my students can ask about what we're learning today. And that's going to be my instructional goal. I'm going to set up a place for them to do that. And that's already taking something a little bit from your plate and just shifting it over to theirs. So when I think about how we approach this book, it's really not, can I do everything in here? Because that's not what I wanted it to be. It's what makes sense for my students, not even all the time, not even every day or every minute, but sometimes what can I try?
Nice. So as we mentioned at the start of this episode, this isn't just for secondary teachers working in an ELA context. There's a lot for English language teachers too.
Definitely. This book is broken down into 4 pieces, or stages, and all of them have a lot of relevance when working with language learners. Let's see what those stages are.
These 4 stages to what I call hover-free teaching are meant to move us from a place of belief where, for example, the first stage is our mindset. Examining our mindset. Do we truly believe deep down inside, not just through our words, but through our actions, that all students can learn and have the capacity to have that autonomy in their learning and that agency? Do we believe that? Because if not, that's kind of the first place it has to happen. It's easy to change our actions. It's not so easy to change what we think. So that first stage, that first chapter, there are a bunch of mindset-based activities. Like there's a fun Cosmopolitan-style quiz, like, oh, you might be a micromanager if you do these things. You can test yourself. And it's meant to be very appealing, but also, how many of us see ourselves in those behaviors? For example, one of them is that, you teach bell to bell. And that sounds like a good thing, but maybe if every single minute is planned out, you're afraid of what might happen in those spontaneous spaces, that kind of thing. The second stage is also what inspired the book I just finished writing, which is about reframing relationships. And it's not about relationships in the traditional sense. We talk about building rapport with kids, and it's super important. We have to know who they are. I believe that. But the question I have continued to ask, and that's why I just wrote a whole book about it, even if we know a kid from a personal perspective, does that mean they trust us enough to speak out in our classes as learners? Are we validating them from an academic standpoint as well as a personal one? And I would argue a lot of the time that we're not. It's not on purpose. But the same kid who might talk to us about football will not raise their hands in our class. And why is that? So that's what that second chapter explores, because until you have that trust, you can't really have a kid who's going to feel comfortable being like, oh, I got this. I'm a confident learner in this space. So then the third stage is planning for engagement. And that's where we can. How do we pull kids into how we plan our lessons? And I'm not saying they're going to take over the content or the curriculum. We're the teachers, we do that. But it's more, how much do we let student experience and prior knowledge inform how we teach? Do we ask them questions about what they already know? Do we know what's worked and what hasn't? Are we getting frequent what I call feedback on feedback, which is they say, oh, I'm not really into group projects. And we say, okay, well, why don't we try it this way today? And you're letting them know that you're listening and trying new things. Or even if you can't try the new things, you're telling them why you can't. So it's a dialogue that occurs on a regular basis. And then the fourth stage is choice-based instruction, which means that where possible, which cannot be all the time, you do give them options for how to learn. And there are a variety of ways to do that. And again, depends on what's happening. But maybe it's 1 day a week that has more of a choice-based structure. Maybe it's 2. Maybe depending on the class, it's most days. I talk to, teachers who do classes like architecture or foundations of technology, and they're basically very project-oriented. So a lot of days students have choices. So it depends on your content.
That was a great summary. Super succinct.
Yeah, and I love how these chapters really move through the process of reflection and application. I'd love to know which of these areas you have struggled most with. Mindset, relationships, planning for engagement, choice-based instruction.
Well, I think building relationships can be hard. I mean, in general, I'd say I'm good at building relationships with students, and English language teachers tend to be really invested in that, as we saw in episode 37. Our friends of the podcast all expressed pride in their rapport building. But I always wonder what my blind spots are. Am I building relationships with every single student in my class? Do I prioritize some students over others? Am I equally encouraging everyone to take agency in their learning? It takes a lot of practice and perception, doesn't it?
Totally. It's always important to examine how we're creating relationships, how we're giving all students agency over their learning.
Yeah. So what about you? Which step have you found challenging?
I guess I would say I have struggled the most with choice-based instruction. I tend to get carried away. I've done a lot of work with stations, and while I love the concept of station rotation for reinforcing skills and discovering new content, it is possible to go overboard.
You have to limit the number of stations you create, right? Otherwise, it can be overwhelming.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we asked our listeners their thoughts on integrating student choice into instruction, and we got so many incredible and different responses. Dustin from Sandman Stories Presents podcast shared that he incorporates choice as much as he can, but does keep choice restricted to keep everyone on the same track.
That makes sense. It's hard to relinquish all control, you know?
Yes, it definitely is. I'm sure many teachers feel the same.
Another listener contribution, Kim, also known as the ESL girl, loves giving students choice boards for practice activities and in assessment settings. I've done a lot also with these choose your own adventure exercises. There are a lot of different ways to demonstrate mastery of a single objective.
Yes. Our friends Etche and Heather from English as a Singing Language also highlighted that you're likely to get more buy-in from students when you give them choice, going back to this idea of agency, right? They wrote that even something as simple as, do you want to be in groups of 3 or 4 for this activity, can go a long way.
Yeah, a long way. And Sherry McKay reminds us that offering choice doesn't only boost a learner's sense of autonomy, but can honor their experiences as an individual. From a trauma-informed perspective, you really want to make sure you're offering choice in prompts. She says, quote, some topics can be triggering, and you don't want to wait until the student is uncomfortable to offer another choice.
Oh, yes. That's so important, Sherry. Thanks for bringing that up. And thanks to all of our other listeners who joined the conversation.
So it's pretty clear that offering choice is something we see value in as teachers, but it's not without challenges. Let's see what Miriam had to say about her own challenges and those of the teachers she's worked with.
This, transformational moment and reflection and writing the book, and which stage do you think is the most challenging for most teachers?
I would say the one that was most challenging for me, and probably challenging for a lot of teachers who are behind this ideologically, is that fourth one, which is how do we design instruction to look this way? Because on the surface of it, it looks like we have to work harder. And it's not actually that, it's that we are working differently, but it takes some thinking to kind of wrap your mind around how your lesson planning process might shift a little bit and how you're creating those opportunities for choice. So for me, I really did struggle with that initially. It was like, okay, so does this mean I'm just making a lot of learning menus and hyperdocs? And then I learned it wasn't about the tools, it was about, I could actually do the exact same thing I was planning to do that day, but just instead of everybody doing the same thing at the same time, I could let kids pick that day which thing they did first. It could be that simple. So, that's hard. That's hard to think about.
The first phase focuses on mindset and understanding how we perceive our learners and their capabilities. That mindset is also really important in that fourth phase, right? Because you are asking teachers to sort of rethink what they've been taught and what they've known and what they've practiced. So I imagine that there are some challenges there as well.
Well, and my thing with that is also no one's asking you to make this seismic shift, either, quickly or slowly. It's just what about this approach makes sense and what do you want to experiment with? Because for me, this happened over a period of years, and, I had to get to a place where I was comfortable with the idea of it not working in that moment and to drop it. You have to be very comfortable with failure. You have to be very comfortable with mistakes.
I've definitely presented ideas that teachers have balked at because they thought I was asking them to make a seismic shift in their instruction. I've probably been there a few times myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we all have. I think it's the default for a lot of teachers when we're asked to reconsider how we do things. We have to be comfortable with uncertainty about the possibility that something may not pan out the way we expect it to.
Most of us already beat ourselves up when our lesson plans don't go according to plan, even though we tell listeners not to. Right?
Yeah, do as we say, not as we do.
So, the goal of this approach is to be more hands-off. Right, but it does take front loading and preparation, but now we're hearing that maybe it has to do with more of just sort of shifting our way of thinking about planning. So either way, we do imagine that teachers are skeptical about all of this sort of hands-off approach. So, and that's especially true when they're working in, challenging teaching contexts, either with large populations or we say populations placed at risk. Have you encountered this resistance from teachers, and what's your response to them?
So, not really as much as you would think in terms of resistance. I think a lot of people really do want to do this because they perceive that it will be better when they get to whatever the destination point is, and there isn't a destination; it's a journey. So that's the good news. Having said that, I think that depending on what the at-risk population is, depending on the level of differentiation that you're encountering, I can't tell you what you are dealing with in your classroom. And so if you say to me, I have a child who will not sit down, who will not stop disrupting my class, I cannot do anything to stop this from happening, and I just need to be a manager right now. Okay. I mean, yeah, you have to do what you need to do to make sure that learning takes place. And if that means that in one classroom or with one kid or with a group of kids, it's just not going to happen right now, cool. Just because it's an ideal state doesn't mean it's always possible. But the other thing is, it's almost a kid by kid, and this sounds very challenging. It's almost like a kid by kid approach. Because in a classroom where you have students who are experiencing challenges of different kinds, that's all happening to different degrees, right? So you could do groupings, or you can find ways to even work with a group of students who might be presenting a singular challenge while letting other students have a little bit more freedom. So as you get to know, what I say is know your class, get to know your class and figure out what you can do. And even if it's just, again, one thing. If your hover-free victory is that instead of writing a list of worksheet questions, because worksheets are not fun. So if your victory is that you have kids writing some questions themselves and presenting them to one another, then that's your victory of the day. It can be a very small thing.
I love for that framing of this as a victory. All of these are victories, and we need to know who our learners truly are. And each teacher is an expert on their own class. If you try something and you realize you need to back off, you can do that. It's flexible. And I really like that aspect of, how you're presenting this approach.
Well, because if you're saying you need to be agile, that means you also have to be agile and drop this when you have to. It works both ways.
One of the first messages that you shared with us is that you don't have to do all of it. You can do just little pieces. And so something that we really appreciated that you had throughout the book were these, sort of sample activities and these reflection questions. There's an opportunity to sort of pull what works for you. And so I think that it goes beyond, knowing your learners and your school, whatever context you're in, to also understanding yourself as an educator and what you're able to do at any given time, because that's going to differ depending on the season as well. So I think that those little activities and the reflection questions can help educators, readers say, this is a great idea. This would work with maybe this set of learners in an ideal situation, but not right now for me, right? And there is that sort of that dissonance that we have to address sometimes.
And you know, the thing about being a teacher is that you have to address that dissonance on a daily basis. You might be a different teacher first period than you are fifth, depending on the kids you're working with, depending on all kinds of factors. And so, you know, there's a certain unevenness to the version of us that people get.
I really appreciate that Miriam takes into account how all of this is going to look really different from one context to another. The students you have, the mood you find yourself in, the time of the day, all of these factors impact your ability to make these changes. So, no, we shouldn't feel like we need to do all of these things at once.
And in theory, even doing some of the things that Miriam presents in her book will set us on the path to hovering less. But what exactly does that mean, really?
And if whenever we want to understand the difference between micromanagement and management, we think about whether or not people trust us. For example, we have all probably in the past had authority figures in our lives who didn't trust us and who were looking over our shoulders, seeing everything that we were doing. And they might have been parents, they might have been teachers, they might have been supervisors or bosses. But the point is, we all have to manage everything. Management's part of life. We have to manage our lives, we have to manage other people's, and we have to do so judiciously, but understanding that everyone brings something to the table, whatever table we happen to be at. What happens with micromanagement is that our students are with us and we don't trust them. We don't think that they will do anything if we're not there. We don't think that they have any responsibility, interest in our classes that we're not driving. And that sends a message that they shouldn't. And as a result, we don't get as much from them when they're thinking, oh, well, you know, this is her class. Not our class, it's her class. So management is the skillful instructional methodology we have around figuring out who is doing what and how we're conducting ourselves and what role our students play versus the role that we play. That's management. Micromanagement is, I'm doing everything because I don't trust any of you. And a lot of that is born out of fear, too. Micromanagement's really common in less experienced teachers. There's a reason for that. Like I remember the nightmare I had every year before school started early in my career, which is that all the kids are screaming all over the room and I'm trying to get their attention and no one's listening to me. And I had that fear, especially early in my career, but I think it took a while for me to realize that a well-run classroom wasn't a quiet one where the only voice was mine. Yeah, so that's what comes from experience and time and believing more about our kids.
So just having it presented to me like this, like the difference between being effective in classroom management and being a micromanager, I'm sold. I just hate being micromanaged. So I want to avoid that.
Doesn't everyone? But yeah, when it's presented this way, it does shine light on a challenge a lot of teachers face. There's a fine line between classroom management and classroom micromanagement.
And in a language classroom, micromanagement or just too much teacher involvement in general can become a hindrance in student learning.
And yeah, language production is the center of all of this, right? So the fact that you're taking the speaking a little bit away from the teacher, you know, and placing the speaking and the writing on the students really fits nicely in with what we're trying to do, which is increase opportunities for communicative practices.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that opportunities piece. We sometimes think we're being compassionate when we take on a lot of the instruction. And what we're really doing is we're stopping students from having those opportunities. Like my favorite instructional method or technique, wait time 1 and wait time 2. And they're very standard, but we use them wrong. You know, the average time we're supposed to wait when we pose a question is 5 seconds. If you look at the research, the average teacher waits 0.5 seconds.
Yeah.
Because it feels interminable, you know, and you want to jump in and rescue somebody. But in that time, you're stopping somebody from talking. And then my favorite one's wait time 2, because then after they say something, if you wait another 5 seconds, they'll usually elaborate. or another student will jump in and say something. So think about how much language we're cutting off just by trying to do something good.
Yeah, I love that you're focused on how that's so well-intentioned, that the teacher's not doing that because they just aren't trying to be good teachers. They just want to get through the lessons. It's just that they want to provide that scaffolding, and maybe it's just overdone, maybe.
Yeah.
Most of what we do, we are doing it to help kids. That's why we're there. But it's just that, there's so much happening and there's so many decisions and so many moving parts that we don't see when we're accidentally shutting down a moment. We don't see it because it's the expectation for that is too high. So we sort of have to plan for that.
It's those little details like not waiting long enough for them to respond, or feeling that we need to insert ourselves in after, a student says something before another can say something. We're sort of undermining all of our efforts there.
Well, the implied messaging, are you there to tell me what I already think? Or are you there to form thoughts yourself? Because if all we want is for students to say what we think, then we're not really teaching them. Our class is a game that they have to figure out.
So something that really spoke to me was this attention paid to detail. It's all in the details. Making seemingly minute changes to your instruction can yield huge differences.
Yeah. And also this idea of putting the onus on students and augmenting learner accountability. That really resonated with me. Part of our job as teachers, even if some might disagree, is to prepare our students for life outside of our classrooms, to build skill sets that will ultimately make them successful in life.
Shey and I both really picked up on this quote, why should students be held to strict time constraints when it comes to completing work when a deadline often occurs at the expense of real growth? Isn't mastery of learning more important than a date that is often arbitrary? This is on page 45 of your book. We just love that. But we could imagine that that's very challenging for many teachers. And maybe for students in some cases.
Logistically, even just that.
Yeah, given that deadlines are a part of the adult world, so to speak. So how would you respond to that?
I mean, first of all, I agree with it. So I agree with what this objection is. People cannot do things that are unreasonable. So my thinking around this is to challenge what you think is a deadline versus what's actually a deadline sometimes, first of all. So the end of the quarter is the end of the quarter. An exam or a summative kind of assessment is due when it's due. There are things that we cannot change, nor should we change, because those are hard lines, and we have to respect them. What I was thinking more about this was there are times that we assign deadlines that are not really based so much on a real need, as opposed to I need to teach kids about deadlines. So it's which is which. When's the work coming in because it has to come in because you need time to grade it. Versus what am I assigning this deadline to because I just think it's a good idea to have deadlines. Because the part of the thinking of that I would challenge is that, first of all, I wonder if it's our job to teach kids about it. I'm just putting that question out there.
That's a good question.
I know that's a controversial question, but is that our primary goal when we're assessing work, is to teach kids about deadlines? Or is it to figure out what they're knowing and what they still need to know and be able to do? The other thing is this whole adult world construct. I just think it can get a little bit interesting that adults who don't actually follow deadlines or due dates in the way that they are telling children they will. And I'm not saying we don't. I mean, we pay our bills and we have to turn our grades in by a date. We do that. But I have never met an educator who doesn't disregard certain deadlines and due dates. So are we really being as authentic as we could be with this goal that we have? I guess the ultimate message is this. Our first goal is to teach them things.
Our subject
a deadline area. Right. So a deadline or a due date is a necessary evil sometimes. And we feel that too. We have to grade things and we can't do anything about that. But when we have choice, when we can be a little more flexible and we can be a little bit more lenient for the sake of getting a better product, can we do that? That's really the thinking behind that very controversial statement that you just read. But here's the thing that I would say to the teachers that I teach or the adult learners that I work with. If I'm going to be lenient about when you can give me this assignment based on a range of time, which is a very real world kind of thing, then can you do that for kids when you can't?
That's a taste of the real world right there. You can push deadlines if you talk to another person in a reasonable way, right? You have a life. That's also a life lesson right there.
Well, and a lot of our kids, we don't know what they're dealing with. That's why I get so angry when people get sarcastic with kids who show up in class late or who show up after not being there.
Oh, it's mean.
It really makes me angry because they're taking care of relatives. They are working at night. They have so much on their plates. And you don't know what their lives look like any more than they know what yours looks like. So why are you making assumptions? And the only thing that you should say to a kid who showed up in your class is thank you for being here.
So I'm glad that Miriam brought up the need to check the assumptions that we make about the lives of the students in our classrooms. We really don't have any idea what they're up against.
And it's especially important to be flexible when we're working with non-traditional and or adult learners who, without a doubt, have obligations outside of the assignments we give them, right?
Yeah, and also working with culturally diverse learners.
Yeah.
Classroom hierarchies are different in other countries, as are values in general. So it would be short-sighted and ethnocentric to set the same expectations for everyone we come into contact with.
Yeah. We've discussed this bit before, this idea of flexible deadlines. I'm glad that Miriam was able to address this skepticism. Working with English learners, we worry about learners' level of autonomy, proficiency in the target language. Those two things are super important and critical elements in this sort of framework that you're sharing. So how can teachers account for these kinds of considerations using your approach?
Probably in addition to the whole strategy we discussed earlier around the language production and increasing that where possible, also just increasing the level of choice. For example, when we think about reading, the teacher who's the expert in reading level and Lexiles and what students can access has a selection of texts that kids can choose from with a selection of topics. And then kids can gravitate toward what they would most want to read in that moment. That's a gesture that means a lot, and also it leads to higher engagement. So, this is one thing I find a lot is that when you have texts that are not as complex with language, sometimes the content becomes less complex as well. But that's not appropriate for the age group. You don't want a 16-year-old reading something that a 6-year-old would have read. That's just not okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So as the teacher, if you can provide kids with really rich choices about content that they care about, like, maybe you have reading about getting a driver's license or how something works, or a holiday or a celebration, something that's very relevant to their experience, and you're providing choices for what kids can look at. I think that means a lot.
Yeah.
So that's one strategy that I like to think about. And then autonomy, maybe if a student is hesitant to present a project or a presentation one way, give them the choice to do it a different way. If it's a task that's about writing, they have to write it. Like, that's just how it is. That's the standard you're testing. You're testing writing. But if you're trying to just have an idea communicated, and a student says, is it okay if I, create a presentation and I talk through it instead of writing it? Okay. So saying yes when you can.
Miriam highlights how allowing student choice to govern what they read in a classroom increases engagement and buy-in. But it also helps create an environment that says to the learner, I value you, your interests, your culture.
Yeah, I definitely saw a lot of overlap between this idea and that of a culturally responsive curriculum, for sure.
She also reminds us that just because a student's language proficiency is lower doesn't mean that their cognitive ability is lower too. Students come to the classroom with rich backgrounds and unique knowledge that only they can contribute.
Yes, it's so important to honor students' funds of knowledge.
Ah, yes. Louise Moll. Listeners, we'll add some goodies to the show notes on this, but essentially, Louise Moll says exactly that. Students all bring a wealth of knowledge to the classroom, and that as teachers, our job is to excavate whatever makes them unique. I love that thinking.
I can see how it could be transformational. And on that note, we asked Miriam what teachers can do to start transforming their practice.
So if we're being specific to the book, then what I would say is flip through it, look at all the tools and tables, and think about what jumps out, and just try that one thing. Whatever, like try an activator. Activators we do at the beginning of learning. We do them to figure out what kids do, what kids already know. We use them to guide our instruction. Pick an activator that sounds appealing and go with that. If we're being more general, I can give you one of my early tiny details, which was talk less. Consciously talk less. That's why we talked about wait time earlier. Sit in uncomfortable silence and see what happens.
The world won't end.
But a child may talk.
Yes. Sit in the discomfort and you might have a breakthrough.
Powerful stuff.
Listeners, we've linked Miriam's book, Teach More, Hover Less, in the show notes. We hope you'll check it out.
Oh, and even more goodies.
Miriam
is a busy bee, and since we spoke to her, she's released another book called Lead Like a Teacher, which came out on March 28th, 2023.
Check that one out too.
And while you're at it, we would love to hear from you. What have you done to ensure your classroom is driven by student engagement and choice? How do you avoid being a helicopter teacher to your students?
You can join the conversation on social media or email us at teacherthinkaloud@gmail.com. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.